Hey everyone, welcome to Connect 23. Thanks for joining us. We are starting now. For the live translation and captions, please scan the QR code on your screen. We'll be doing Q&As at the end of the workshop, so please leave your questions in the form being displayed at the top of the screen. During the workshop, we have two live challenge where you will have a chance to win a $30 gift card. One gift card will be drawn for each challenge among the correct answers. Don't forget to scan the QR code on the screen when it appears. Winners will be announced after all Connect 2023 workshops are completed. Now I will hand it off to WooleyWool to talk about accessibility in games. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my Connect talk. I'll be talking about accessibility in games, as it was mentioned. So before we begin, I'm just going to give a quick little agenda of what we're going to be talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself. Who am I? Somewhere around the platform and your walls, the usual. And I'll be talking about what accessibility is all about. Like, we've heard about this thing, we've seen it. Like, what is it? And then I'll be talking about like the different types of accessibility. So we're going to talk about like visual impaired people who have like visual impairments, motion related accessibility, and hearing related accessibility. And then we'll also be discussing throughout those different areas about like the different ways of implementing certain settings or certain features so that players with those different disabilities will have the opportunity to play your game in peace and serenity. And then we'll also talk about like, just like recapping about like what are the best ways for implementing it in your own games. And finally, we'll be going over QAs. All right, so a little bit about myself. So you might have heard about me. I'm everywhere. I am a programmer. I love to do programming, anything with like art. Keep it away from me. It's like super bad whenever I build something. Like, no, don't give me anything with art. So I do a lot of programming. I am a community events organizer. So I like to host events that are like game development like areas. So I'll be discussing, like, I do a lot of like events about like programming and like development. Like, I like to show off like what I'm doing. I am a former accelerator. I did summer accelerator last year. I got to work with a team of 5 to create a game called Dawnwood. It was really a great experience, in my opinion. I got the opportunity to learn a lot more about programming, to which I have been applying to this day whenever I am working on larger scale projects or even my own projects. And I am a university ambassador. Roblox has this ambassador program where it lets you talk to different people in your university to get people on board about what Roblox is all about, get them to learn more about it. And that's a bit about me. These are just some of the different games I've helped out with, or I say projects too, because I had the opportunity of helping out with a huge YouTube project. But yeah, I got to help out with Steep Steps, Dawnwood. I got to co-own a game called Holiday Frenzy, Death Sandbox, and I got to also co-own a game called Boxing Sim. Alrighty, so like, what's accessibility? Like, you might have seen it. Like, you might have seen those ramps, might have seen the stairs with like the ramps nearby, might have seen elevators, might have seen like those parking spots that are like, man, those are so close. I wish I can have that spot. Well, that's like what accessibility is like there for. It's like it's meant to help people who may have a like difficulty. So like, for instance, there are people who have a hard time going upstairs, or they have a hard time having to walk a far distance. So there are these different accessible features available for people so that they're able to get to their destination or wherever they have to go in peace. So we have like those different accessible features that you might have seen. And so you're probably thinking like, okay, so we know what like accessibility is about. It's like, we're trying to give those who have like difficulties doing everyday tasks an ease to those challenges. So it's like, all right, so what about in like games? Well, have you noticed that there's like that little settings button? Might have seen that. Have you noticed that there's like you can change like the keybinds in like certain games? Like, you can have your own, like, if I want to shoot something, I can just press A, or I can change it to space or whatever. Or you can change like the different sound volumes, or even like rendering or changing like the graphics for a game, because devices can't even play it. Like, that's what accessibility is all about. We want everyone to be able to play our own game. We don't want to put people at a disadvantage based on whether or not they're physically disabled. They have different disabilities or even like their device is different from everyone. Like this is what we are looking out for whenever we're working with accessibility. So with like the different, settings and everything, we have to like discuss about like, the control schemes are between like the different devices. So like, players will have players on like the PC, we'll have people on like mobile or console, but you also have to like try to make it so your game is a lot more suited for each of those areas, because you don't want to put anyone at a disadvantage, because putting people at a disadvantage isn't really fun, and it makes it a lot harder for people to play a really simple game. So for instance, with like PC, we tend to use like keyboards or mouses to play our games. Mobile is a lot more like touch based. So you'll see people tapping, clicking, whatever with their different control mechanics. And then we have console based, which is like, with controller, you're just trying to like press the right or left trigger. And so with all of those different control schemes, we have to consider like, how shall we edit the different, gameplay elements so that anyone can play our game regardless of device. And then we also have to consider like, the UI setup, because like you might have seen some games have like ginormous buttons, but you have to also consider like, those on mobile will have an easier time trying to tap those like larger buttons, because on mobile it's really hard to get your finger to like, have to tap that. And if it doesn't register it, you have to tap it like a bajillion times. And then finally it registers that you tapped it. So, you have to consider like, having larger buttons for mobile, so it's an easier time for tapping. Or like, even for people with physical disabilities, it's a lot easier when the button is a lot larger, because you don't have to like, you won't have difficulty trying to tap it or click on it, because like, it's a lot larger. And finally, with like smaller buttons, you have to consider too with like the PC and console, just because of the resolutions, because like people with higher resolutions are going to have like, ginormous like buttons on their screen, and that's kind of distracting a little bit. So you want to make sure like, the buttons are like scaling correctly. We don't want it to be like, really like taking up their screen space, because like sometimes it is a bit distracting, and we don't want people to feel distracted while playing your game. And in addition to the UI setup, we want to make sure like everything is readable. We want to make sure text is easy to read, because it is important. We don't want to confuse players while they're playing the game. And also with coloring, we want to make sure like, the text doesn't blend in with the background, because if it does, that kind of sucks. Like I don't want to have like a reading test while trying to read black on black. So we want to make sure that the coloring is great, so that it is readable for players. So since we know what it's like in games, let's talk a little bit more about like the different types of accessibility. So let's start off with like the visually impaired section. So I'll be like giving out some examples, some color combinations, and like the considerations with this area. So to start off, I'm going to show you this video that gives you like an idea of like people with different visual like impairments, just so you can like think about how people are playing your game, and like how their different like visual impairments may affect them while playing your game. So while viewing this video, like consider the different like vision scenarios. Think about how your game will ensure that like the majority of players can see and decipher the important elements of the game. So here you go. So as you can see, like, this is like normal vision. And then what if you have something with the cataracts? Normal vision again. And then you have glaucoma. And then again. But now you have macular degeneration. So those are just like some of the different like visual impairments that do exist. So just thinking about that and ways to make sure that your game is a lot more understandable and readable, and like everyone is understanding what's going on, is important. Alrighty, so now I'm going to put you guys to a little test. So there's this thing with like the color blindness test. Are you able to like read these numbers? Like to a lot of you actually, it is easy to read, but there are people who are colorblind that can't read this because of the color combinations. So you have to consider when you're creating like your UI, colors like green and red are not like next to each other, or purple or blue, because it makes it harder for those who have color blindness, like to decipher between like, the different like numbers or like what's going on. So like I said, can you read these numbers? And if you can, well, you don't have color blindness, but if you can't, then it just shows like, it is a bit hard. And then finally, in addition to this, like here's some really bad color combinations, and I'm gonna give like a quick little warning. Like it is a bit straining on the eyes. It really hurt my eyes when I was trying to create these examples, but it also gets to the point like don't choose these color combinations. So like look at these. Don't they hurt your eyes? Like, that green and yellow, white on yellow, no, thank you. So you want to make sure that you're considering good complementary colors while trying to create your UI, just because it is a bit, overwhelming. And yeah, so we want to make sure everything is good for that part. So for your considerations with like, visuals, you want to make sure with coloring, like, color combinations are going to be your best friend. They are very important. Whenever I'm trying to create UI or trying to make sure that it does not like strain my eyes with like the different colors, I use this tool called Adobe Color Picker. It's like, it's a lifesaver. It like you put in your color and it tells you what are really good color combinations. It's like, oh, it's so great. It's like, it's a lifesaver. I will say that. So if you have the chance, I would totally look at that. And also another thing with the color combinations is, like I said, avoid bad color combinations just because it distracts players from playing your game, does strain their eyes. It like burned my eyes while I was trying to create the example. So yeah, we don't want that. So we want to make sure that, our color combinations are on point, and if there are any discrepancies, it's being taken care of. With the Adobe Color Picker, it is free. It's a nice little tool. All you have to search up is just Adobe Color Picker on Google, and you shall find it. In addition, with text readability, we want to make sure that the text is readable. And with that, we want to make sure like, the text size is like scaled, because like for people with large resolutions, if the text isn't scaled, it's going to show up very tiny for people, and that's going to really make it harder for people to read what is going on in your game. They'll have to get like a little magnifying glass or something just to read it. So we don't want that. So we want to make sure it isn't too tiny, and also we don't want to make it too large, because if it's too large, it just distracts the player. In addition, with like the tiny text, we want to make sure that it's not too tiny, just because if it is too tiny, people on mobile will have a harder time reading it, and we don't want to make it harder or put anyone at a disadvantage with those tiny texts. Like I brought up before, we want to make sure that the color text, like the text color, isn't blending in with the background. One nice thing I have learned a lot is if you use this thing called text strokes. It's very, very nice. Like for instance, I like to put my text with like white background, like a white color for the text, and then put a black stroke over it. It just makes it a lot easier to read. And another thing that I wanted to bring up is like, the use of patterns. So you might have saw earlier with like the color blindness test, like, it's hard for some people to like decipher what is being shown. And you have to consider with color blindness, as you can see at like the bottom right image, if those icons did not show up, they just see colors, like they just see gray. Like they can't tell what those colors, like which like team is representing what. So it's really important to like put icons or like patterns or something, just to help identify like, oh, this is a different color. Like there are games, like I know that are like color hide and seek, or like avoid the monster by doing like having this color. So trying to make it so that players are able to see like, oh, this pattern is what I'm trying to look out for, will be very important. So it can help make a discrepancy between like the teams, colors, and more. Yeah. So that's about what visual impairment is all about for accessibility. I'm going to go on to motion impairment. So I want to give a quick little background about who I am. So if you did not know, I am physically disabled. I cannot do the everyday tasks that people can do. For instance, I have to change the way I have to put my clothes on, or put my shoes on, or like I can't ride a bike. or I have to avoid stairs because stairs they're a nightmare. So when I saw like those images of like the ramp and the stairs, I was like, oh, I need that. That's like my best friend. Or like the handicap parking. Oh, I always make a joke. It's my VIP parking because it makes my life easier. So when you're working with games that are a lot more motion based, you have to take into consideration about like, okay, so those who have a motion impairment, how can we make it so they're able to play our game in peace? Um, and so like whenever I'm playing like different games, like I'll say like Arsenal, for instance, I'll put that out there. Um, that game is a lot harder for me to play. Like on PC, I'm so bad at it. Like I feel like I'm the human shield in that game because like I can't move fast or like the controls just don't fit with like what I can do. So like for instance, for me, I am someone who can't really use the WASD. I use arrow keys whenever I'm playing games. So games that are like heavily WASD and arrow keys are just kind of there, it puts me at a disadvantage while I'm playing different games, and it's not really fun sometimes. So that's just a little bit about who I am, just so it can get you thinking about like what are ways I can better make your game suited for those who have an emotion impairment. So like with the considerations, you might have seen like games that have like different keybind options. So like players who like to change their keybinds to their liking can do so. There's like usually you can just like click on the box and it tells you like, okay, now press the button on your keyboard and that's going to be your new keybind. A lot of games do this, like FPS games, they do it and it's like super nice. Even those who don't have any like disability or anything like to do this just because like, you know, it gives them the opportunity to play the game how they like to play it. Because you have to remember like, you know, these are your players who are playing your game. So we want to make sure that players are able to play your game in peace. Um, in addition, like, you know, we want to make sure that keybinds are very like concise. We don't want to have anything that's like too confusing or it's just too much. Like for me, I hate the keybinds Control Shift V, which is like pasting without any like formatting. That is like the worst keybind I ever have to go through, and I am so thankful that there is just right click and then paste without formatting. If that did not exist, I would be very sad. But we want to make sure like, you know, we keep it at like one key per action. Anything that's more than that is like usually considered like a no-go zone. Like don't do that. Like avoid that at all costs, please. Thank you. I beg. So we want to make sure like, you know, it isn't too much for players because like those who are physically disabled will just be put at like a disadvantage. It makes it a lot harder for them to play their game. And also we want to make sure like, you know, if we are working with like concise keybinds, we want to try to keep it like using like common keybinds like to start off with. So like a lot of games, you know, you'll see them like have shift to sprint or like E to toggle. Like players on Roblox are so used to those like keybinds and like, you know, for those like certain actions. So we don't want to make it harder for them when they're trying to play your game. So trying to keep that as the default is usually the best plan. And with that, we'll start with our first quiz. So I'm going to let all of you know now that the quiz is like so hard. It's impossible. You're going to cry about it. So I'm just going to let you know it's going to be so hard. So the first question is, if your game contains keybinds, should you allow for custom keybinds? One of the options is no, that's too much work. Or the other one's, yeah, I wanted to ensure players are comfortable playing my game. Choose wisely. I'll say that. I'll give it like 30 more seconds. Righty, 10 more seconds. Alrighty. Let's go on to the next part. So I'll be discussing about like the hearing impairment related like disabilities. I see someone saying it's too hard. I know. I tried to make it like impossible. I don't want you guys to win those gift cards. With the hearing impairment, we want to make sure that we're like, I'm going to be talking about like the use of visuals and like what are the considerations with hearing related things. So here's a little video about like what to consider with like hearing related elements in your game. I want you to take a look at these two different scenarios. this video comes from Roblox's accessibility guide. I want you to think about like, what's the difference between the two? Which one's a lot more helpful? Even those like, that may have like harder time hearing or even their volume is muted. So let me know what you guys think. And hopefully the audio goes through. So as you can see, like with the second scenario, it has like some sort of UI or like like a particle effect to show off like, oh, there's something going on right here. And that's like really important to like show off. Like if you're having anything like sound based, just so that players who are like muted or like they have a harder time hearing, it just it shows like the difference. So hopefully you can see the difference and you can apply it in your own games. So with the considerations with hearing, we want to allow players to like change the sound volume, because I'm gonna let you know right now, if I go in your game and it's like blasting audio, I'm closing it. So like we want to make sure that like I can change the volume settings, because I appreciate my hearing. A lot of other people appreciate their hearing, and and those who like do have like hearing impairments may have a harder time or maybe too much for them. So we want to make sure that we are weary of that. So we want to make sure like the default volume is respectful. It isn't too much. In addition to that, with like sound-based games, we want to make sure that like you can play the game muted if it's a sound-based game. Like there are games that like depend on like, oh, something's close by, and you can't really tell if there aren't any like visuals or some sort of way to know like, ooh, something's coming by. So you want to make sure that like you can play your game muted if it's a sound-based game. This can be done, with like particles, UI, or like different elements. You can be as creative as possible. You just want to make sure that it is known that something is going on. And then you also have to consider those like, as they are hearing impaired. We don't want to put them at a disadvantage. It's just not fair for them. And we want any player to be able to play our game. And also like we have to consider like, what if I'm one of these people, by the way. What if I just join the game and I set the volume to 0? Like, what about those players? We don't want to put them at a disadvantage. Like that's like the majority of your players right then and there, because a lot of people don't like to have the volume on whenever they're playing the game because they're afraid of like what's going to happen. So we don't want to put those in a disadvantage. And like I brought up too, please be mindful with like the different volumes. Loud volumes are really disrespectful to those who are sensitive without any warning. So if like your game does depend on like sound-based like elements, make sure that you are warning them about that. Anything that is like really loud, like let them know before they're joining, because it does get people prepared in case of anything. Alrighty, and then here's quiz 2. To let you know again, it's a little hard. You're gonna hate it. You're gonna like log off of this Connect. So yeah, I'm just gonna let you know it's impossible. The question is, when working with sound-based gameplay, should I add additional features to help the hearing impaired? One of the answers is no, that's too much work. Nah. Or the other one is, yeah, I want to make sure that my players are able to play my game and they are comfortable playing with my game. I'll give you like a minute. Alrighty. I will go on. All right. So now you've been sitting here for like, what, 20, 25 minutes? You're sitting here, you're hearing about all these different like elements with accessibility. You're like, okay, why should I care? Or like, oh, this random guy on the internet is talking about accessibility. Like, oh, what can I do in my own game? So with that, you have to consider like with your own game, like, there are just different things to take into consideration with your own game. That was like really redundant. But so like one thing I want to bring up, and it's really important, is no game will have the same accessibility settings. Like every game is different. there may be like similarities here and there, but like every game will come out different. Some games will not even need accessibility, like um, any game that like has no sound or it's just like a base plate or something. Like there are games that are like just you don't need any accessibility related features. So you need to take into consideration of like what is needed for your own game. So I recommend doing lots and lots of research. As I brought up, every game is different. So some games like FPS ones, they require like motion based settings like changing keybinds. um, Games that are like really sound based will take into consideration of like changing sound volumes, or like even role playing games, they have like background music, so being able to change that. And like the different visuals, we want to make sure like your game is like it's readable, it's understandable. And in addition to that, you want to like get feedback from your players. Like your players are your audience. You don't want like to create features and your players are not they're not able to use it, or like they're not understanding how to use it, or they're being put at a disadvantage. So I always recommend doing a QA test from players to understand like what can be improved, what can be done to make it a lot easier. A lot of times with like these QA tests, a lot of people will talk about how like the controls are a little bit confusing or a bit overwhelming. A lot of times like the coloring with the UI is a bit hard on the eyes and readability, etc. You want to be mindful of what players are requesting, because just because like you don't experience like these difficulties, like these are your players, you don't want to diminish their thoughts and their concerns, because you want everyone to be able to play your game. We're all here to learn and grow. And so it's really important that you are taking into consideration of what players are requesting, and any areas that can be improved, because we want our game to be as successful as possible, and we want to make sure that any player is able to play our game. So yeah, thank you. Hope you enjoyed it. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Said. Thank you very much, WooleyWool. Let's get to the Q&As. Please remember to send all your questions in the form being displayed at the top of the screen. Let's start with the first one. Brigadeiro says, what was the most challenging situation you have faced regarding accessibility in games?
Ooh. I have to say, I always tell this to a lot of people. Any game that is like very like first person, or it's like very like motion heavy, is a really difficult game for me to play. Because like for instance, I'm sorry, Arsenal developers, if you're here, I'm so sorry, but I have to say it. It's very hard for me to play that game, just because like the controls are a bit like there's a lot that's going on. Sometimes you have to like move your mouse super quickly, and like I'm glad that they have like the different accessibility features in that game to help alleviate like the different like hardships that are going on. But there are times where it's just like it's a lot for me like to play that game. I've seen other games, like these aren't like really major, but like there are a lot of games that have like poor color combinations, so it's like really difficult for me to like read and understand what's going on. So that's like pretty much my hardship.
Let's get to the next question. This is a long one. Under
Hmm.
My Will says, when you mentioned FPS games like Arsenal being more difficult to you to play, what are some other things that may not be as common in most games across the industry yet that will be extremely beneficial for accessibility?
Ooh, I would say like it's really nice when games allow you to change your keybinds. I have to say that is like really, it's very nice. It like it allows for players to like have the opportunity to like change their control schemes and everything. But also there are a lot of FPS games that are off platform that allow you to like change like the speed percentage of like how fast your mouse is going to be moving, or like your camera's going to be moving, or like um, allowing you to like see visually like, oh, there's like for instance, like there's this one FPS game that like lets you know that there's like shots being fired by like showing this like red like box that's being shown above. It allows you to like see like there's something over there, maybe avoid that, maybe go for it. Like it just lets players know. I know there's like other accessibility features that like let them know like, oh, someone's walking nearby, because sometimes like it is a bit hard to hear like, oh, something is walking nearby. So like there are like UI elements to like tell you like, oh, something's here, something's nearby. It's getting a little intensive. So I would say that is like something that I found to be the best whenever I am playing different games, because like um, sometimes I am just like I am put in that scenario where it's like I can't really play this game, and a lot of people will say like, oh well, it's like it's a skill issue or something, but it's not really a skill issue, just because like it's putting me and others at a disadvantage. So it's really nice when there's like a bunch of settings available to allow for better gameplay and a lot simpler of a time to play.
Thank you. Now, 12 asking, are there any Roblox games that you think are the best examples of great accessibility games?
Ooh, um, trying to think. I would say there's this really popular game that you might have heard of and might have seen everywhere. It's called Avatar Catalog Creator. They make great use of like patterns on like their UI, and their coloring is like so great. So it's like really nice to see like the different color combinations, because it's like really nice to see like, oh, I'm able to make a discrepancy between like the different like items or accessories when I'm trying to look through. Um, Trying to think of like any motion based games. I will say I'm gonna kind of plug in one of the games I worked on, Holiday Frenzy. It's a game that I worked on back in like December. What we were trying to do with our game was we wanted to make it so like players were able to like drag like the wheels, so they're able to build it. So we wanted to make sure that on mobile it's very simple to like drag and drop it, and also on PC it's easy to like click and then drag and then drop. Hearing based games, I would have to say Piggy and oh my god, what's that game? It's the one with like a bee. I can't think about it. I can't think of the name. It was like this one with like the beast where you're trying to hide from the beast. They have like this giant hammer. I love how like in the game, it like when the beast is like nearby, um, flee the facility or flee, it's something like that. It was like that one. Um, it was like if you get closer to the beast, the coloring, like the lighting, like makes it a lot more known. It's like a lot more red. It's like, ooh, something's nearby, and the audio starts getting a little bit louder and louder to make it a little more intense. So I found that to be really nice with like for visuals to help players identify what is going on. um I have to say, like, when you're working with hearing and like the different visuals, it doesn't always have to be like UI based. Like you can change like the lighting, the atmosphere, make it a lot more obvious like something is up.
Next question, say, how can developers gather feedback from players with disabilities to improve the accessibility of the Roblox experience?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, so I have like this really funny story. So when I was working on Dawnwood with my accelerator team, I was in charge of creating like the build mode. And so when I was creating all these different control schemes, like, it was working great for me. I was able to move the camera, drag and drop. It was all great and everything. But my developers, my coworkers, they couldn't even play like the build mode. Like they were like, what the heck? Like this is not working. This is not how it's going. And so like you have to take into consideration of like people different preferences, like generalize like what can be done so that players can have an easier time like playing your game with like the different accessibility features. And so like what I usually look out for is I want to make sure the controls are just on point. If there's any discrepancy, if there's something that's going wrong, or like it's making it harder, it can be like even little, I want to make sure that it's taken note of, and then I can continue to improve the design so that players are able to uh, have an easier time playing the game.
Next question, WooleyWool. Tornado Tooth asks, should, should accessibility features be prioritized or be put into consideration before any game design takes place?
Ooh, this is a good question. I would have to say it really depends on like what your like how your style of like creating games is like. So like for me, while I'm creating different elements of my game, I'm always thinking about like, is this accessible? Is this something that is confusing? Is this something that can be better? Is this something that can work on all devices? So I'm always, whenever I'm creating different gameplay elements, I'm making sure that all those boxes are ticked. And at most times, I'll even ask my friends, like, "Hey, are you able to, are you able to like do this? Are you able to play like this element? Like, are you able to do something? Like, it's a lot to like think about like while you're creating like these different games, but it's really important. Like, well, for me, I like to whenever I'm like working with like different like gameplay elements, I want to make sure it's as accessible as possible before moving forward.
Ready for next question?
Yep.
Wizard Ann is asking, as someone who isn't colorblind, how can I pick colors that have good contrast for the players who are colorblind?
Ooh, okay, this is a good one. So actually, I do have a little story about this. So one of the updates for one of the games I got to work on was Holiday Frenzy, sorry, was like, we wanted to make it so like you're gonna be able to see like, oh, I can change my role easily by just like pressing this or going here without having to leave or rejoin the game. And so we had like the different like colored like text and stroke colors just so that players are able to like, see like, oh, this is the different like this is a different role, this is like for this role and that role, just so that there's some sort of correlation between that. And so I always had asked one of my friends who is colorblind, like, oh, does this color work? Oh, is there something that can be improved? And also there's like so many different resources out there to let you know if like this color is going to work with someone who is colorblind. Like my rule of thumb always is like avoid the blues and purples that are together, or like the reds or greens, just because those are usually the common colors that are confusing for those who are playing your game. And if it is a bit confusing, then it may make it harder for them to read the text.
Next question is for Other Rocket. Are there any suggestions on how to incorporate accessibility settings to games that may not be typical accessibility friendly, such as sound based games or FPS games?
Ooh, that's a good question. My best advice for that is always to get feedback from people that may have like a disability in either hearing or or either like physically disabled or may have a hearing impairment. Always try to gather like their different feedbacks on like what areas can be improved, because you want to try to make your game as like generalized as possible with like different settings, because unfortunately it's not possible to make your game accessible for everyone, but you also want to make sure that your game is accessible for the majority of your players. So it is best that you are taking into consideration what your players are saying. If there's any feedback that can be uh, implemented in your own game, it's just very important to be implementing all of that.
Next question is from Tornado Tooth. Is there any other disabilities we should also consider?
Oh, um, this is a hard one. I can't really think of any at the top of my mind. There are so many different disabilities that are out there, and whenever I do see a new disability that I haven't really seen, I'm always applying the person that does have it because they're making it through. Um, I guess like it is important to research or like hear what your players are saying about your game, because like there may be discrepancies or like different issues that they may be experiencing with your game. The three areas like the motor, hearing, and visual impaired areas are just like usually the common ones. I don't know of any that are out there. There may be, but I don't know at the moment. Always looking to improve.
I think that's it for today. WooleyWool. Thanks a
Yay!
lot. This is a wrap for this workshop. Stay tuned for our next workshop, Gain Fun Next Gen Tech, at 3 p.m. PT today. Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you.